kind of a long title, Making the Tough Call, Decision Making When It Counts. And that's where we want to start this morning, is just by honoring the fact that you and I both are enamored when we get to witness or even be a part of an awesome and gutsy decision. There's just something about when we see or hear about somebody who made a really tough call that we go, wow. So look up here on the screen. It was like when Churchill decided that England wasn't going to back down to Hitler's advances, and he declared that England would participate in World War II and not be defeated. I mean, if you ever listen to his famous speech before the House of Commons in 1940, it moves you to places of confidence that you never thought you had. Or more closer to home, how about when Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963, and decided that from this point forward, equality would not be a wish, but it was going to become a reality, a hard-won reality for African Americans in America. I mean, it was a bold decision that he made that day. Or how about when JFK decided that man was going to go to the moon? Some of you remember that, and it was going to happen by the end of the 1960s. And sure enough, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. Or how about, this is kind of a funny one. Some of you might remember this. When Billie Jean King decided that women could beat men in professional tennis. Some of you were alive at that time. It was during the women's liberation movement. And Trevor, some of them were alive at that time. And then some of us were just kids and weren't really paying attention to the news. But I got to tell you, when she upset Bobby Riggs, it totally shocked the sports world. It shocked the whole nation that a woman could beat a man at professional tennis. And that was born out of a decision. Or probably my favorite, when Rambo decided that enough was enough, and he put that fat, arrogant sheriff in his place in the original Rambo movie. I mean, that was a decision. You were alive back then, Neil? Thanks. So the list is endless. I mean, you and I witness it all the time. I mean, when Jimmy Carter decided to come out that he was a born-again Christian, when Reagan decided to write a book on abortion, when Mother Teresa decided to live among the poorest of poor in Calcutta, when Michael Jordan decided to play professional basketball again and again and again, when Rudy Giuliani decided that he wasn't going to allow 9/11 to crush the spirit of New Yorkers. I mean, we see it all the time. I mean, all the time in our world today, people making really hard, gutsy decisions, and they're decisions that count, and they're decisions that we, for the most part, admire, even if we don't agree with them. And yet, for any of us who have ever been involved in making these kind of decisions, it's one thing to look at them from a distance and to say, yeah, that was a really good decision. But it's another thing to be a part of a decision like that and to make a decision like that. I mean, it's just hard. Whether it's a tough call that has to do with your particular job or vocation, or whether it's a tough call when it comes to your marriage, or a kid that's rebelling, or finances that are spinning out of control, or an addiction that's grabbing you, or maybe even having to do with a friend of yours, or maybe even a theological issue in your life. I mean, it's just very hard to make a daring, gutsy decision, to make the tough call, especially the kind that involve God. Because you see, for the Christian who's naturally concerned that our decisions are in line with the will of God and with His purposes, it's even harder. Because you and I, unlike all these decisions that were made here, except for maybe a couple of them, you and I have to consider God's point of view whenever we make decisions. We got to consider His will and His purposes. So it's a much more complex problem than even what all of these people ever had to deal with. So here's what I find. We love the tough call. We love bold and risky decisions that make a difference. It's just that they're really hard to make. And we tend to shy away from them if we can. And if you can relate to this at all, and I think we all can, this is really the next scene that we see in the book of Esther. It's really what's going to happen next as we move into chapter 4. of Esther, we see Esther beginning to make the tough call. And so let me just give you a quick background before I give us our first point here, just so we're all caught up to snuff with what's happening here in the book of Esther. As you might remember, Israel as a nation, because we're in the Old Testament, is in exile. They've been captured and transported to Persia. And Esther is now the queen, and she's married to a man who is a megalomaniac. He's the king of Persia. His name is Ahasuerus. And I'm telling you, he could have been Saddam Hussein's twin. I mean, this guy is just obsessed with power. He doesn't seem to be very bright, which is never a good combination. And he's angry as angry can be. Mordecai is Esther's cousin and father figure, and he has gotten everybody in trouble, if you might remember, by refusing to bow to the king's right-hand man, a guy by the name of Haman. And to top it all off, Haman is so angry and filled with vengeance that he has now declared that in a few months from now, all the Jews in Persia, and there's over 1 million of them, are to be killed. So that's the scenario. That's what's going on in the book of Esther as we enter into chapter 4. And here's the point, guys. If ever there was a need for a tough call, for a bold and risky decision that could either save Israel or bury them forever, literally, now was the time. And here's what is so cool, and that is as we track what happens with Esther and Mordecai through chapter 4, we gain some incredible wisdom on decision-making for our own lives, because they have a tough call to make. And as you kind of analyze how they made the tough call that they made, and you look closely at some of the key points in this chapter here, you're going to find that there's actually something for you and I in how you and I make a tough call. Now, I want to give one caveat before we dive into this, and it's kind of an important one. I'm following the storyline here. This is not a talk on decision-making in the will of God. So this is not a be-all and end-all for how to make godly decisions. There's going to be lots of things we don't talk about over the next 33 minutes as we go to our Q&A time. I'm just going to show you from Esther 4 some key nuggets on how to make bold and godly decisions, okay? So give me a head nod that you all understand it. Don't come up to me afterward and say, well, what about this? What about that? You forgot to say this. Well, I'm going to say because we're not in 2 Timothy. We're not in 1 Peter. We're not in 3 John. We're in Esther, and I'm going to share with you from Esther what it is that I see about some godly decisions and how to make them, okay? So with this said, 3 things I want to share with you, and here's the first thing. And it might even be good that you don't have notes in front of you, because that way we can just journey along with all of these things. And it's this, and that is that sometimes in life, tough things happen that require a difficult decision. Emphasis there on the words tough and difficult. That sometimes in life, tough things happen to you and me that require us to make a difficult decision. I got to tell you, man, this is the whole context of what is happening here in Esther chapter 4. It begins with Mordecai and most of the Jews throughout Persia in a state of great mourning. It's very interesting. Verses 1 and 3 talk about a great mourning that Persia is going through. Let me read it for you. It says, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, meaning that now the Jews were going to be exterminated because of his decision not to bow, it says he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. Then skip down to verse 3. And in each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, again, that the Jews should be exterminated, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Now, a tough thing has obviously happened to scattered Israel. As we've already noted, because of Mordecai's one act of obedience to God, obeying the first and second commandments, to not bow down, to have no other gods before him, there's now come to fruition the projected annihilation of all the Jews. Mass genocide for all the Jews is about to happen, and they all know it. And so when it says there that Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and wailed loudly, and that among the Jews there was great mourning and weeping and wailing and sackcloth and ashes, what you need to know is that in that culture these were signs, outward signs of inward distress and mourning. I actually respect Middle Eastern culture that way. I mean, every culture develops their own signs and symbols, if you will, of how we mourn. But one of the things I love about the Middle East is that their expressions of mourning were very graphic, very dramatic, and I think gave full vent to what they were feeling. I mean, smile at this a little bit, men. You know, when you and I, in our sophisticated American culture, mourn, what do? We journal. We go to therapy. We cry alone when nobody is watching, and then we rage at others when we're driving down the freeway. I mean, that's what you and I do to mourn today. But in the Bible, they did so much more, I would argue, sophisticated in releasing ways of mourning. They would actually do physical things that symbolize the inward burning and desert-like experiences they were going through, and they would even do so publicly to show their distress. And I would argue, this maybe for another sermon or another message, that this was a very healthy way for them to mourn. But they were mourning nonetheless. I like how one expert Bible commentator says it, and I quote, he says it's the absolute low point of the entire story. That's what's happening here in chapter 4. And then interestingly, in verses 4 through 8, Esther finds out what is happening through veiled communication from Mordecai. And it's here that something very interesting happens. Look at verse 8 up here on the screen. It says that he, meaning Mordecai, also gave him, now this is Hathach, Esther's attendant, a copy of the text of the edict which had been issued in Susa for their destruction. Now get this, men, that he, Mordecai, might show Esther and inform her and order her to go to the king to implore his favor and to plead with him for her people. So focus on those three words that I put there. I got to change that color. I put there in pink that I want you to focus on. And those are the words show, and then inform, and then order. You got to latch on to those words there. Because what's happening here is to our point here, and that is that Mordecai is calling Esther to make a difficult decision in the midst of a very tough circumstance. He's calling her in a highly challenging way. That last word, order, there, literally means what you think it means. It means to command or to charge someone. Interesting, in the Hebrew, it's the same word used by God to Adam and Eve when he commanded them to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Same Hebrew word. So with the strength that God told Adam and Eve, don't eat of that tree, it's interesting here that Mordecai is saying to Esther, I order you to go to the king and to tell him about this plot because you're married to the guy and you got to do this. Now, you would think Esther would say, done deal. But not so quick, because Esther's response is basically the fact that it's not as easy as you think. And then she tells him why. Now, this is where it's important that you remember that I said earlier that King Ahasuerus was very similar to Saddam Hussein, right? I said that earlier. Because you see, this king that Esther was married to had a rule. And that rule is that if anyone, and he meant anyone, was to come into his inner court where decisions were made for the kingdom and had not been personally summoned by the king, then he or she was to be killed. That was the rule, unless, of course, the king chose to have compassion that day and extend the golden scepter as a sign of his benevolence and his kindness. And that's what verse 11 there is laying out. And so Esther basically says to Mordecai, my husband, the king, is a nutcase. And he's obsessed with power. He's driven by anger. And if I go barging in, pleading for my people, even though he likes me and has a soft spot for me, it could be the death of me and the end of Israel. That's really Esther's response. And before we go any further with this, men, let's pause here right now because I think we're left at this point with one overriding theme about this world, and that is our first point, that sometimes in life we experience difficult circumstances like they were doing back then that require, literally God orders us to make a difficult decision. I mean, I just think that's something that Christians need to recognize and start to dial in more often, because I see a lot of Christians weasel out of decisions that are right before them, and they come to me as a pastor and they say, well, I got this issue in my life, Pastor. What do you think I should do? And I don't know always what decisions you should make, but I do know this. You need to make a decision. You're at a crossroads. Something's going on in your life right now in which I can tell you this. God is telling you you got a decision to make. So your marriage is in trouble. You got some decisions to make. You've experienced a job loss or maybe even a job opportunity. You got a decision to make. Your teenager is slowly drifting away, or your grandson is slowly drifting away. You got a decision to make. Somebody close to you gets a terminal illness, or you have health problems. You got a decision to make. Sometime a kind of temptation comes along and you start to dabble in it. You got a decision to make. You're spiritually really dry and empty, and you're just drifting away from God. You got a decision to make. You guys get the idea. There's lots of times in life where difficult circumstances happen to us, and we have a decision to make. And just, I know it sounds simple, but one of the first things we need to see in Esther is that the first thing we need to own is that I do have a decision before me. I don't know what it's going to be yet, but I got to do something. The worst thing I can do is sit here. And what's so cool about the spiritual life, in my opinion, is that God usually tends to bring a Mordecai into our lives. Like Esther had Mordecai, Mordecai said, hey, Esther, you got a decision to make. You're the queen. You got some pull here. We need you to do something. I find that God usually brings somebody in our way that points out to us that we have a decision that we need to make. There have been plenty of times where I've had difficult circumstances in front of me, and whether it's my wife or a good friend or an elder at my church or what have you, that they'll point out to me that I have a decision before me and I need to do this. And so in Esther here, though God seems distant and silent, nevertheless a decision still needs to be made. And I think that's part of the message, too, before we move on to the second point here that you and I need to recognize. And that's what makes this such a hard chapter in one sense. Because if you remember, this whole book of Esther is about the fact that God is seemingly far away, right? I mean, he's not mentioned in the book. His law is not mentioned in the book. And so God seems absent in this book, and yet the Jews are about to be annihilated. And a decision has to be made. Now personalize that to your life. There are times when you are very spiritually dry, when you're very far from God, but yet you're going to experience some difficult issues in life, and you still have to make a godly decision. Have you ever been there? I have. I was once doing a study break in the year 2001 in Jackson Hole, where my parents owned a place at that time, and I was on a 2-week study of the book of Hebrews, getting ready for a huge book study I was going to do on Hebrews in my first senior pastorate. And I had been on a dry spell spiritually for literally, guys, months at a time. Months. And I didn't feel close to God. My prayers were kind of dry. I was staying in the ring with him, as I've always told you to do, but let's just say I was not in the best mode to make a godly decision. And I get an email on this trip from my home church in Cleveland, Ohio. I was pastoring in Canada. I was in Jackson Hole. I get an email from my home church in Ohio where a guy I'd never met says, I'm the head of the search team for our senior pastor search. Our founding pastor, Ludd, who was my mentor, has retired. And he said, we've been doing a nationwide search. We had about 100 candidates. We've whittled it down to 5. And even though we didn't tell you, you're one of the 5. And he said, and we just need to know if you're going to allow your name to stand and for us to talk to you or not. I'm looking at this email, and literally I said to God, this could not come at a worse time, God. Because I've only been in Canada now for 2.5 years, transitioning a very needy church, and yet now I'm required to make a decision for whether I should go to my home church or not and pastor them. And I remember saying to the Lord, I do not feel qualified to make this decision right now, God. It wouldn't be easy if God would say, well, yes, Jamie, you're not, and you felt spiritually dry, so zap, you're no longer spiritually dry. But it never works that way, right? I mean, just because I have a tough decision to make doesn't mean God is obligated to make me unspiritually dry. That's not a word, but you know what I mean by that. So not at all. So here I am at a crossroads where I have to make a difficult decision for my life, and I really did have to make a decision in the midst of a very spiritually dry time. I'm guessing you guys experience similar things. So the question becomes, how do we make a decision in a vacuum like that? How do we make decisions at certain crossroads, especially when God seems distant and dry? And again, I just want to go on record saying, before I give you the second point, because I'm going to show you what Esther 4 says, is that what I'm about to share with you isn't the be-all and end-all on how to make a decision during a dry time. There's lots of biblical principles that the Bible gives us, but it's interesting. There is one thing that Esther does share here that I see tucked away in this story that has helped me over the years on how to make a decision, especially when God seems very distant, and it's this. Sorry, this was all stuff you should have seen. Here it is. And that is that if it costs you something and it benefits others, there's a good chance that you're making a right decision. I think that's what Esther 4 teaches us. If it costs you something and benefits others, then chances are you're making a right decision. Now, and I got to tell you, man, I love this principle I'm giving you here because it's been a really good friend to me. I don't hear it said all that often from the pulpit because it seems somewhat secular, I know at first glance, but I'm going to show you it's not. I think this is thoroughly biblical and in line with how God has made us in this world. So let me show you from the text here. Look at Esther chapter 4, verses 13 to 14. These are Mordecai's words to Esther when he is totally challenging her about the decision that she needs to make. Now get this, men, and the choices before her. He says, "Do not imagine, Esther, that you, be in the king's palace, can escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." Now, men, don't miss what's going on in these words. Two things that Mordecai is essentially saying to Esther here. And that is that he's saying you cannot, first he's saying you cannot hide or be silent. You cannot hide or be silent. He basically says if you try to hide, you will most likely be found out as a Jew and fall under the same fate as us. And if you try to remain silent and just say, I'll be neutral on this, he says God's still going to come through with deliverance. It's just that he might use another means of deliverance. And you're saying, like, what? Well, there's been many means of deliverances for God's people in the Old Testament. There's been Jewish revolt. There's been sympathetic feelings from other nations. I mean, there might be other ways that God would use, but Mordecai's saying he's going to come through in some other way. And basically he's saying, Esther, you're only thinking of yourself and trying to save your own skin. Tough words from Mordecai to Esther. So the second thing he tells her is risk and act. Make the decision to go to the king anyways. Think more of your fellow Jews than yourself and your own safety. And as we know, in response to this clear challenge, Esther utters 3 words in verse 16 there that will forever change the outcome of this story. And those are the 3 words that are reminiscent of Isaiah chapter 6 with Isaiah, or with Matthew 28 with you and I in response to the Great Commission. And they are the words, say it with me, men, I will go. But in all of this, don't miss that the core of Mordecai's challenge to Esther, now I find this interesting, the core of his logic to her is simply that though the choice to go to the king involves a significant risk like banishment or death, the decision Mordecai is suggesting is really not all that difficult, because if the potential result could be to save Israel and give life to others, then the right choice is obviously to go to the king. And what I see in this, men, is that this is what being selfless and other-centered is all about. And I think it's teaching us here that it's God's way. And Esther sees this and agrees to do it. I think it's a truism about life this side of heaven. I think it's a key principle to living the Jesus life and a God-honoring life that you and I need to start incorporating into our personal spiritual decision-making, this ethic that if it costs us something, even our very lives, but it benefits others, and maybe even particularly God's people, then there's a good chance that God is on the side of that decision. I've thought a lot about this over the years. I call this God's reverse economics of decision making. God's reverse economics of decision making. Let me explain. Most of us have fallen into decision making kind of like our world makes decisions. And tell me if this isn't true. Here's how our world makes decisions. Our world says that if it costs others and benefits you, then you will succeed. I'm telling you, that is free market economics right there. Supply and demand. If you want to be successful in the economic realm, develop a product that others want and that they're going to pay for, get them to buy it, make a profit for yourself, and you're on your way to success. If it costs others and profits you, you're a success. That's that's the fuel that modern day business functions on. It's how to be successful and make money. And it's our world system of economics. Now, let me be very clear on something. I don't think this is wrong. Some of you are starting to squirm in your seat already and think, well, Jamie's getting down on laissez-faire economics. Not at all. I'm a graduate of Hillsdale College, for crying out loud. I believe in the free market very, very strongly. In fact, nothing gives me greater joy than when I see men apply this here in kind of a way that would be ingenious or entrepreneurial, and Scottsdale's filled with that, and I see men succeed, and I'm the first to stand up and say, praise God. I'm so glad He has blessed you that way. Here's my point, however, is that if this is the way that you function in your relationships and in your spiritual life. In other words, if you drag this equation into your walk with God or into your friendships or into your marriage, you're going to make a mess of everything. Because this is not the way that God or Jesus says that we need to function in the more personal areas of life. And I think that's what's happened in America and even in the church. We have taken this wonderful principle of how our world functions, where it costs others, it benefits you and your success, and we've dragged it into our spiritual and relational life. And as a result of that, we wonder why we have trouble making decisions and why we tend to make so many wrong decisions. I mean, think about it, men. Most secular marriages are built also upon this equation. Most secular marriages would say that it's kind of a tit-for-tat type of thing. That as long as I'm happy in marriage, as long as it's benefiting me, and obviously in order for it to benefit me, it's got to cost you something. As long as that's happening, then our marriage is copacetic. We're just fine. But as soon as the benefit for me stops, and as soon as you stop giving, as soon as the stops costing you something, I'm just not happy in this marriage anymore, and I think I'm out. Now, it's funny. That is how Hollywood marriages function. And I would argue that that's how many Christian marriages function. When people come to me and say, I'm out of this marriage, honestly, who committed adultery? Well, I see, Pastor, they didn't really commit adultery. Well, they did in their head, but they didn't really commit adultery. You know, who abandoned who? What non-Christian abandoned the Christian? Well, Pastor, you see, really, that wasn't that way. Well, then what's the problem? Well, you see, the problem is, and then they go this long, complicated story that basically says it's not benefiting me anymore. And it's costing me too much to stay in this marriage, so I'm out. I sit there and go, whoa, that's how our world functions. You've just dragged laissez-faire economics into your marriage, and no wonder you can't make a godly decision. Or how about consumerism in the church? Don't even get me going on that one. Schrader's got a wonderful line. Schrader says that what you win them with is what you're going to keep them with. So Schrader loves it when seeker-sensitive churches whine at some of the pastor gatherings we get at. And they say, you know, my church is filled with consumers. And my church has all these consumers in it. And they demand this and demand that, or they're going to walk. And Tom goes, that's how you want them. He goes, you won them through this highly entertainment-oriented worship service in which you met their every need and gave them all these fluffy sermons and messages, and that's how you won them. And now you're complaining that they're consumers? And Tom's great. He goes, what's wrong with that picture? And he's right. And it's one of the chronic problems in churches today is we got all these consumers basically dragging this equation into church. Church exists for me. And you know what? It better cost you something to make me happy. And that's the way many people view church. I'm telling you guys, this is all over the place. in Christian circles today. But contrast this with what we're seeing in Esther, and that is that Esther's way, or Mordecai's way of functioning in the book of Esther here for decisions, says no, if a decision costs you and benefits others, then it's probably the right choice. Guys, I'm telling you, it's the opposite of our world system of success. It's reverse economics, if you will, the reverse of how our world tells us to live. And that's why I think living the Christian life is so hard, men. Because we function one way in the world, and it's not a bad way to function, but then what happens is that when God says how we're supposed to approach Him, it is a totally different scenario. Because He's trying to teach us something very precious and powerful about the kingdom. So here's the deal. If you're a successful business guy here today, and many of you are, there's a good chance that you succeeded because it was some type of system. Again, not a bad system, but some type of system that cost others something. It benefited you, and hence you had success. Again, that's not bad. But it's just that if you drag this formula into your personal relationships with God and others, you will end up making terrible decisions. Because God's way is polar opposite. He says, if you're going to make a decision that honors me, then it needs to cost you, benefit others. And though that's not foolproof, there's other things to making a godly decision. There's a good chance, if that's your formula, that you're going to be making some pretty good decisions. And so, men, here's how powerful and life-giving this is. And I know you could tell me stories, too. When I look back on my 25 years now as being a pastor, I'll celebrate 25 years next year of ordained full-time pastoral ministry. And I do an audit of my major life decisions. I realize that when I have applied this principle, lo and behold, a good and right decision almost always has been made. Isn't that interesting? I can remember when I was at a major educational crossroad. I was coming out of college, and I was really one of these very activist, passionate young men, and I had just gotten my Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology and Religion from Hillsdale College, and I was offered a position with Youth for Christ in Cleveland. And I was so excited to go on Youth for Christ staff because I'm finally done with study. I get to go and do something and affect the kingdom in a positive way. And I was driving one of our visiting professors from Hillsdale, which is in kind of center of lower Michigan, over to Detroit, because he was taking a plane out, and they had students drive him. This guy was a world-renowned theologian by the name of Carl Henry. He was Time Magazine's Theologian of the Year back in 1978. And I was driving Carl Henry to the airport, and Henry had been a friend and a mentor to me for about the last year, and he said, "So, Jamie, you're going to be graduating here. What are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm going on staff with Youth for Christ. It's just amazing." And he was a Mordecai to me at that moment, because he looked at me and he basically said, you know, when I was much younger, Bill Bright, who was the head of Campus Crusade for Christ, was one of my students. And I told Bill Bright something that I'm going to tell you, and that is that I told Bill Bright that if he went right into ministry out of college, that it would probably be close to a train wreck, because he had zeal without knowledge, and that's always a bad thing. He didn't have enough knowledge to go into ministry yet, and he needed to go to seminary first. And then Henry looked at me and he said, "You don't have enough knowledge to go into ministry yet. You need to go to seminary, and I'll even save you the effort and tell you which seminary to go to." He said, "It's Trinity Seminary in Chicago, where I'm going to be teaching for the next couple of years as well." Basically saying, follow me to Trinity. I got to tell you, that shook my world, because I was so tired of academia at that time. I've always been an activist, so I was so ready to get going. But as I went back and prayed about that decision, as I shared it with my father and other people, I realized that this was going to cost me, but that Henry was right. It was going to benefit others, and I think I needed to go to seminary. And I got to tell you, it was not a fun 4 years. Wayne Grudem hates it when I say this, but I've nicknamed seminary cemetery, because for me, it was a very difficult time. The last thing I wanted to do was do 4 more years of graduate study. And I struggled through it, but it was the right thing to do. I've looked at vocational crossroads. When I felt the call to go into the senior pastorate in 1998, I had a cherry job in Detroit. I know most people don't think of Detroit like that, but I did. I had a cherry job in Detroit. I was the executive pastor of a large church. I was paid very well. I had a lot of influence and authority. My church loved me desperately. But Kim and I very much sensed that I wasn't being used by God in the executive pastor role, as God wanted to use me in a more teaching leadership role. But the last thing I wanted to do was lead Detroit. I even tried to see if maybe the senior pastor wanted to retire at my church, but he was only 47 years old at the time. So the last thing he wanted to do was retire. And I can remember making the decision, saying, this seems nuts, but I got to leave Detroit. I know some of you were saying that's a blessing, but it was our home, and I need to go into the senior pastorate. I could tell you about so many decisions over the years that I've done that, relational crossroads with my wife and with my children, in which I had to make a decision. I'm telling you guys, when you apply this, if it costs you and benefits them, there's a really good chance it might be a Jesus-like decision. So here's what I want you to do this morning. We got just a few minutes to wrap this up. I want you to think about your life right now, and I want you to think about maybe some decisions you're facing. And I want you to think about what the decision would look like, what kind of decision maybe you'd make if you followed this Esther ethic here of costing you something and benefiting others. Well, how would that maybe change a decision that you are in? So I wonder if there's just some of you here today that are having trouble with your marriage, and week in, week out, month after month, it's just been a really difficult marriage. What would happen if all of a sudden you started applying in your decisions with your wife, it's got to cost me, and it's got to benefit her? How would that change the contour of your decision? Or I wonder what the Esther ethic would look like for a parent, or maybe for some of you for grandparents who are dealing with wayward kids that you're about ready to give up on. If it costs me and it benefits them. Or I wonder how the Esther way of decision-making would be done if with some maybe hidden sin in your life. You know, many men don't want to come clean about hidden sins. You know why? Because it's going to cost them something. It's going to cost a little bit of embarrassment, a little bit of humiliation, a little bit of shame. But might it benefit the kingdom of God if men would get more honest about their sins with some safe other men? Larry Crabb said to 2,000 pastors a few years back at a conference I was at with them, he said, no pastor should ever go to the grave without all of their sins confessed to a safe other. You could have heard a pin drop. And I'm sitting there going, I know what all these pastors are thinking about right now. They're thinking about their hidden sin. And they're thinking about, who could I tell? And they're going through their list going, no, 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 no. But I live that way. I have men that I confess my sins to. And I think that's a healthy way to live. Catholics do it all the time to a priest. Protestants are told to do it to each other. Confess your sins to one another so that you may be healed. But you see, it's going to cost you to do that, right? You guys seeing how this decision-making thing tends to work? I wonder how this way of making decisions would affect how we use our money, how we make choices on our job, how we handle conflicts with others, how we make decisions in every area of life. I wonder what would happen if we would start to consider this way of making decisions. And to be sure, some of you are saying, well, Jamie, come on, I'm still confused. I don't know if this simple thing is going to work in the decisions that I make. And so, this doesn't solve all my decision-making problems. And I agree with you that. But here's one of the last things Esther teaches us, and with this we'll go on to some comments. And that is that in the end, with whatever decision that we make in our dry spiritual times, we commit our way to God, and we trust in His absolute sovereignty that He is going to guide us. I want you to look at the closing words of Esther in Esther 4, in verses 16 to 17. And I think, again, you have to look closely in Esther because it's not this overt epistle that spells everything out it's saying. It's a narrative story and one that's absent of some theological categories at that. But look at Esther 4 and how it closes here. I think this is instructive. Mordecai is speaking to Esther after she makes the decision to go. And he says, go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Interesting. God's behind the scenes. Fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens, Esther's speaking. I and my maidens will also fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had Now, that's interesting. What's the word? Just as Esther commanded him. Same word. Same word. I love that one. Mordecai commands Esther, you better make this decision. It cost you, benefit the kingdom, make the decision. She says, okay, I'm going to do it. Now I command you to go, and let's get really spiritual right now, and let's fast. As you guys know, this is again for another whole thing, fasting in the Bible is actually a very complicated thing as to why people fast. Some people think they know why everybody fasts, but there are numerous reasons people fasted in the Old and New Testament. One of the reasons people fasted, according to Bible experts, is what they call a fast of intercession. A fast of intercession, meaning that as we are interceding for God in prayer, you fast in order to underline that prayer. You give up something on the physical in order to emphasize the spiritual. Does that make sense? So you detach from one area of life so that you can attach to another. That's a fast of intercession. That's what some experts say are going on here, and I think it is. I think it's Esther's way of committing this decision to God. And then don't miss what she says at the end there. She trusts in him. She says, and if I perish, I perish. It's so reminiscent of Daniel, isn't it? When he goes into the fiery furnace, and he says, you know what? God is God. If I burn up, he's still God. But he has the power to make it so that I don't burn up. And so either way, I'm trusting in God. And I think Esther's basically saying the same thing. My life is in God's hand. So here's the deal. In the end, as you and I make decisions, hopefully decisions that cost us and benefit others, even as we make them on faith, we commit our way to God. We commit them with fasting and with prayer and with focusing on the Lord. And then we say, as I always say, and this isn't in the text here, but I do all the time, I'll say, God, if this decision I'm making is wrong and crazy, please run interference for me. Block my way, do whatever you do, and I'm wide open, I'm listening, but this is the direction I sense that you're leading me in, so I'm going that way. And we commit our way to God, and we trust that he will guide us. I think that that's a wonderful way to make decisions.